Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Yo the World's Pop TV session. My name is Alicia, and today we are going to be talking about inclusive education and thinking deeper about what peace building means within inclusive education. As a reminder, we have been looking at the themes of Agenda 2030, also known as Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs for short, with particular focus on goal one of ending poverty in all its forms for the first few weeks of the POP sessions. And now we've progressed on to moving into talking about goal four, which is education for all. We have just two sessions left for this year's POP TV, and we look forward to providing you with a recap of sessions on the POP portal. Some of them are up already, but feel free to visit us at any time at eotopop.net, eotopop.net, to catch up on some of the notes from the sessions. They're displayed there on our blog, and then you can also learn more about the culture of peace. Your thoughts are also welcome at any time. There's a chat box to my right, and we appreciate your feedback. So if you choose to, feel free to add any questions or comments or links, anything like that that you would like to do. Or if you choose not to, we also appreciate you viewing the sessions. Inclusion, let's talk a little bit about inclusion. So inclusion is the opportunity for people with disabilities to learn alongside learners in the mainstream with consistent, ongoing support. Without proper planning and the rest, inclusion is less effective because people with disabilities can have any number of accommodations that are needed to help the person fully grasp the educational material. Inclusion is quite often talked about in terms of children, which is important. However, since we have been piecing apart bit by bit the concept of education for all, the key to this discussion is to also remember that inclusive education should be along all stages, since education for all is a lifelong learning process. So the lifelong learning process for education for all includes informal and non-formal, as well as formal education, some of which we've talked about in the past, and therefore inclusive education extends throughout adulthood. To see how inclusive education can become integrated within the concepts we've been exploring in past sessions about education for all, there first needs to be a basis of understanding that there are nuances to what inclusion looks like, because people with disabilities, they have distinctions that require attention to detail so that their individual needs are provided for. What do you think about inclusive education? Does your thoughts right away go to people with disabilities? I started out talking about inclusive education being about people with disabilities, and that is part of inclusive education. But as we will learn, there's actually more to this topic. So let's first start with a common understanding, which is inclusive education being about disabilities. Disabilities can come in many forms, and this makes inclusive education a thoughtful challenge to approach. Some people have physical disabilities like limited sight or mobility or even hearing, while others might have cognitive or learning disabilities that affect the way that they learn. An example of that is mental retardation. And other people experience mental health symptoms that can impair the way that they're able to learn. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the person has to have a learning disability in that instance, meaning that they don't have difficulty learning in the same pace as the mainstream when they're not experiencing the symptoms of their particular diagnosis. And an example of this type of disability is someone that suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, that experiences specifically symptoms within PTSD, such as memory loss or difficulty concentrating. That's definitely a category that we have to consider as well in terms of disabilities for inclusive education. Even further, there are people with any combination of disabilities too. It's worth noting, though, before we move forward, that and exploring inclusive schooling, that disability is not always recognized within a particular community of people. So some people may choose to view their circumstances as just a difference, um, and not a disability. And it's really important to put the care of the person in focus. They know what they would like to identify as, and so you need to be able to respect that in order for inclusive education to really um, encompass the values that we're going to be talking about in a little bit. And so, after all, being inclusive in its broadest sense is about not leaving anyone out. And there has to be a collaborative approach when there is learning, so that it's leading the way on how to best help the particular person or persons. And certainly there are some ways that people do not experience disability that can become more aware. And the underlying purpose within this particular session is to give you something to think about so that you can stretch your understanding about the topic. So for a long time, inclusion within schools has been debated. Should children with disabilities be taught within the same mainstream schools or traditional schools as other students? And there are many ways that we can look at this. I'm sure you can have examples. I'd love to know what you think about this particular topic. Should people that have what's often referred to as special education needs be integrated with people who are in the mainstream? And for some communities, they see examples of that already happening with the integration, and for others, they may not. And I'm curious to know why do you think that is? There's often very much stigma around having special education needs, and we're going to be piecing apart what the values of inclusive education are, so that these particular values that we can hold on to are the things that can be replicated in the types of behaviors and the types of schooling that we want to see. But in the broad sense, looking at it from a global perspective, because we like to bring you a global perspective that you can then piece apart and apply in your individual settings, the international community has already called for inclusive education. So the broad answer is yes by the international community. Yes being that children with disabilities should be taught within mainstream education. So we've talked about the Education for All initiative, and I'll expand a little bit here because although we've talked about the Education for All initiative, it actually sits on the shoulders of the statement that I'm about to go into depth about, to bring more understanding so that we can understand what inclusion means within education and the international guidelines for the standards that the majority of the world has agreed that would like to see happen. So there's something called the Salamanca Statement and Framework for Action on Special Needs Education. This took place in 1994 in June, and there was a World Conference on Special Needs Education talking about access and quality education. So just to give you a little bit of reminder, the Education for All initiative was not something new. It's been talked about for a long time in terms of how to get education for all. Certainly, it's embedded within the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that everyone has a right to education. So it's just expanding the dialogue throughout the decades about what that means, how to achieve that, and how to improve on it. So based in the framework are concepts of inclusion that are about celebrating differences, institutions that are for everyone, supportive learning environments, and responding to individual needs. The aim is to make sure that schooling is more effective and removing the isolation that has been traditionally accepted for people that have special education needs. And this is really important because We now have 1 billion people, or 15%, roughly 15% of the total global population that experience some level of disability, and actually 1/5 of that 15% experiences severe or significant disabilities. So it's not just it's actually a smart idea to um, to integrate people, because it's not very smart to continue to isolate people that can provide perspective and lend power to the world's social and economic progress. And if you're interested in looking up more about that particular statistic, there are a number of places that you can go, but one of the places that's really easy to read and breaks down the topic is actually from the World Bank. So we'll definitely have that link available when we post the notes. So as I mentioned in previous sessions, the Education for All has been a concept that's been developed over many years. And this framework is reaffirmed by both the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the World Conference for Education for All that took place in 1990. So this was even before the Salamanca Statement and Framework. So the framework itself from Salamanca, it reaffirms also the SDGs, which took place in 2015, specifically Goal 4, which is a lot of what we've been covering in these past few weeks of POP sessions. And the aim for the statement, it's aimed at childhood education so that it can be diverse, with keeping children at the center of the focus, as the best way to combat discriminatory attitudes and create welcoming communities, as well as to provide the best cost-effective, uniform education that builds on an inclusive society. And so within that framework, they call on different communities with specific aims, most notably the government and then the international community. I'm going to talk a little bit about what it means for the government level and then what it means for the international community. And we're going to find some really interesting values, and hopefully it'll give you more insight about inclusive education. So for government, the first thing is to make inclusive education the highest budgetary and policy priority. Let's just stop there for a minute and think about it. In a world that increasingly is experiencing conflicts, particularly wars, and whether they be civil or between countries, and certainly we don't want another world war, but we have had world wars in the past. What would have happened is if education that was inclusive, that celebrated differences and built more inclusive societies and had those values as a uniform way of having education across the world, what would have, what would be the possibilities? I mean, we have to actually think of it in that way to figure out how to get to a society that is conducive for peace. And this is what it means to build a culture of peace. You actually have to be thinking about it, you have to be doing it, evaluating, so on and so forth. And part of that is putting your money where your mouth is, so to speak. So if you have your highest budget going to education and not, say, like in the instance of the United States, defense, militarism, and building up on this notion of needing to protect in a way that is that can lead to violence, without opening avenues of diplomacy and communication, and having education that ensures that people will have and hold on to values that can really push forward the world's economy and the world's cultural interactions in a more positive way, then you can start to wind up having a better results when you make that a high priority in terms of your budget. And certainly there's no easy road. We have to be cognizant of how the nuances have gone as a result of previous interactions, but we should never stop moving forward and progressing the reverse. So again, making inclusive education a highest budget priority and policy priority becomes important for building forward in the future. The other thing that the framework calls upon is for governments to enroll all children in regular schools unless there's a compelling reason not to. By and large, many people, many children can be enrolled in regular schools. And that also actually calls for regular schools to expand its thinking and way of reaching children. It then calls on the government to encourage parent participation and strategies and interventions from the schools themselves to make it easier for people to plan and evaluate what the needs for inclusive education are. So that includes researchers and having access, moving through a lot of red tape, or actually removing red tape so that the research can happen and the organic flow of learning about what is needed and applying it can be front and center. It also calls for governments to share information between each other, between countries, to improve inclusive education and to make sure to invest in vocational training with inclusive education. And this is really important because educating people is great, it is important, but without adequately preparing people for the workforce, cuts off the ability for people to really contribute to society. And it's a really frustrating thing to have a wealth of knowledge with no real means of applying it in a substantial way. And then finally, it calls for governments to have a significant teacher education for before they enter the school, and then also while they're in school, so they have continuous on-the-job training to improve special education within an inclusive school environment. So that's what it talks about in terms of government. And now we're going to talk about what it calls for the international community. And it actually calls upon, again, upon governments, but in a more general way, as well as the international fund agencies. Those are sort of your large agencies like often the UN departments, to endorse inclusive schooling as a more important part of education, and then strengthening the technical cooperation to make sure that inclusive education becomes a reality. So this is really important. So you have the budgetary measure that the governments that are being called to have for their national schooling system, but then also governments fund some international agencies. They pull together money, and these agencies are able to operate as a result of that. And those agencies need to be able to help the cooperation around inclusive education. So they are often helping NGOs, for example, that are that they do not work with the government, which is NGO, non-governmental organization, but they help to complement the work that the government is doing. And then it moves forward into saying specifically for those NGOs, that the NGOs that deal with country programming and services, that they work more with the official national bodies to better plan, implement, and evaluate what takes place to provide inclusive education. So they're just reiterating the need for not just governments to reach out, but also NGOs that deal with country programs and services to also reach out and to work together collaboratively to figure out how to move forward inclusive education. And then it goes on to speak very extensively, because this is something that comes out of the UN. It's the international body that draws together a lot of the thoughts and the roadmaps for the international community to take back to their individual regions and nation states to implement in the way that best works for the nuances of their economies and um, and cultures. It talks specifically about the UNESCO education structure, and UNESCO again is United Nations Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. It's the education agency of the United Nations, and so it calls for strong support from UNESCO for inclusive education in all that it does. And that would include supporting other organizations that enhance the knowledge that teachers have on the topic. So this is not just NGOs in terms of the other category that I just mentioned that does country programming and services, but it could also be NGOs that work on a more local level. Maybe they just target a specific community in a specific radius. Um, that the neighborhood can then be developed and or rather the teachers within that particular school and within a particular neighborhood are being developed on the topic of inclusive education. So if you remember that earlier, I asked you what you thought of when you focused your attention on inclusive education. And then I mentioned that there's more to the topic. So we can actually find out more about the scope of the inclusive education topic within the framework for the action on special needs education. So what I just went over was the statement itself that came out of Salamanca. It's long, but I just condensed it for you so that you understand the the nuances of what they call for, really just the international community and individual governments, and how to work together on the national level and the local level. Um, the framework for action, though, that provides national guidelines for governments that they can use to create uniform, inclusive schools. So it also provides guidance for the regional and international levels. And this is really just the meat of it, how to actually implement the grander wishes that people can apply that are government officials and that are NGOs serving national community um, programming as well as local programming. And the perspective about the action on inclusive education environments and how to create them is actually quite clear. And I'm going to actually read from you the text because I think that it's very powerful by itself. And it says the guiding principle that informs this framework is that schools should accommodate all children, regardless of their physical, intellectual, social, emotional, linguistic, or other conditions. This should include disabled and gifted children, street and working children, children from remote or nomadic populations, children from linguistic, ethnic, or cultural minorities, and children from other disadvantaged or marginalized areas or groups. This is really, really important as a definition because inclusive schooling is not just about disabilities. It's not just about making room for children who have disabilities, but it's also about making a way to educate children of different circumstances that make it challenging for them to meet in classrooms. Education comes in many environments and many forms. So if you think about it that way, why should schools be limited to one type of location? Have you ever heard of um, traveling schools where learning takes place outside of the classroom and into everyday transactions in addition to the actual classroom? There's some or even high school students that I've seen that takes the approach a little bit of study abroad that people normally get in university level. And one place that you can go to learn more about that that I think is really cool to learn about is Think Global School. So it's thinkglobalschool.org. That's just one example for you to really understand that education is not just within the brick and mortar school, sitting at a desk in front of a chalkboard, that it's really something that is expensive. And of course, in education, at this point, we're talking about formal education. We discussed informal education and non-formal education in a past session. But the formal education does not have to be limited to a traditional classroom setting either. It's still something that is structured, it's still something that is uniform in the way that it is implemented, but the fluidity of people, of children being able to participate is what makes the difference. And that's really important because children who are working for whatever the reasons is, um, as we continue to try and combat poverty on more significant levels, those children still need to be educated. Even though they might have to work still for a time, they still deserve to be educated. It is their human right to be educated, and it is our responsibility, particularly as adults, to make sure that we provide that. That's just the way that it is. And it's also important to recognize gifted children and not to figure out how to have gifted children integrate into school systems that are mainstream as well, because typically that's also the other population of students that get isolated, right? And if you think about it, that can perpetuate this idea of superiority, of being of more value, and really, that's that's ridiculous. If you happen to be gifted and you just have a different way of seeing and exploring the world, that can really be helpful, but you need to be able to still have people skills and to know how to apply your intelligence um, in ways that can still further the betterment of an inclusive society. If you don't know how to do that, you increase isolation, you increase discrimination, and it takes the dial backward instead of forward for the world being able to um, have as much of a culture of peace as is possible. It really requires for us to work at it, and we have to be intentional in every level. So, by the definition of the framework, perhaps you can broaden your initial thoughts of education not taking place in the classroom. The framework doesn't suggest to take away traditional classrooms. I just want to be clear about that. But it does see it as a way to, in the way that I've understood it, to broaden how the concept of the classroom reaches a variety of populations. So, what might that look like? Are you in an area where there are a lot of street children? How can education reach them? If you're a teacher, you have to think about these things, or you should be thinking about these things. I recommend challenging yourself to think about these things. Governments should absolutely be thinking about these things. And it requires for people to constantly put to task the governments that are responsible for them to be inclusive to every area, every population, and not just pigeonhole themselves or beholden themselves to people who maybe have a lot of money or some other type of clout or status that can only further along political, individual political agendas. Now, I want to talk a little bit about peace building and what that could look like in terms of inclusion. Um, Today's session is really just giving you this broad overview and really focusing on the values so that you can really think about how those values show up in your everyday life. Um, and we'll dive a little bit more in terms of what it takes on a individual level, just as a volunteer, on what it means to be a part of Education for All, initiative and what your role is and how to move that forward in terms of a culture of peace. But now that we have this understanding of inclusion as this broad definition that includes many levels of diversity, that is celebrated and supported, keywords, right? Celebrated and supported, it should be easier for us to identify how a culture of peace is a foundation to inclusion and what we can do to support it. I'm going to give you some really quick categories and challenge you to think deeper. And certainly, if you have some suggestions, feel free to go ahead and add that in, whether a live chat or you can send it to us as a comment at any time. We're always here. And we do read everything. So whether you send it to us as a message on Facebook, those of you that have, you know that we respond to you. So really, we want to keep the conversation going online and off. Okay, so the first thing is, in terms of values, we need to see every child as worthy to be adequately educated and every person as having something to gain from it, including yourself. We cannot achieve resilient communities without everyone receiving access to adequate education that is without obstacle. That's a mouthful. It's a really loaded thing because it requires for us to then piece apart what it means for people to be worthy, right? So that goes back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where worthy is inherent in each person's state of being. And so that means that regardless of their geographic location, regardless of their ethnicity, regardless of their race, regardless of their religion, their creed, I mean, we can go on and on and on and on down the line, that it means that people, that children in all of those areas need to be seen as valuable members of society that need to be educated on an adequate level, not subpar education, because that's not what's going to help us in the grand scheme of things, producing people, children who turn into adults who are not going to be productive members of society. That's just not a great way to go. And it's what we are seeing in pockets of that are backlashes to the way that we haven't really prioritized in budgets, in policy, and in everyday action, having an inclusive education mindset. So what does that look like? That means children who are incarcerated, they have a right to education. Whether they're in there because of sometimes state-sponsored violence, and we can talk about controversially what happens to children in Palestine and the West Bank, for example, when they come before military courts to be sentenced to these lengthy prison stays for something as mundane as being accused, because they may or may not have been the person to do it, of rock throwing, right? Those children, are they in school? Are they getting properly educated? They're still a part of the human world experience. So why aren't they, if they're not getting proper education? Children who are refugees, the crisis is bad enough that they have to undergo, but then to not receive education is to cut off the opportunity for those children to be able to think critically about how they are going to contribute to a more positive society that can lessen the very factors that cause for them to become refugees in the first place. Children who are poor, and that could be children who are so poor that they have to work, that they need to stop traditional school because it's just that the hours aren't accessible to them, the school fees are too high for parents. that needs to be figured out. Certainly, it costs money to run schools, but also this falls also in the hands of governments where they have to have this high budgeting and policy priority so that things like school fees cannot be a barrier to achieving education. And so that means that as the adults in situations, whether or not you have children, to advocate for these things and ensure that your governments, local and otherwise, are concentrating their money in that area and to push for those things is very important. Also inherent in the dignity of these children and inclusive education is, of course, religion, and respecting and celebrating the diversity of the different types of religious practices and what that means in terms of learning, but not just for them, but also for the other children around them. The process also inherently has to be, or should be, needs to be, needs to be reciprocal. I think people get really um, up in arms, for those that get up in arms about inclusion, in terms of diversity, is that the one thing that I've noticed is that people start to feel like their particular way of operating, their level of diversity that comes from them contributing, gets overshadowed by someone else. And and I think that that's because it's often not talked about in terms of mutual benefit. It's one-sided in the way that it's talked about the benefit of the ones who haven't yet been added to the inclusive field, to benefit the benefits from it. But it's a two-way street. So we have to develop language around that, and reinforce that language. And certainly there's a lot of ways to explore that, but the key is to start exploring that and asking those questions and putting that in neighborhood town hall meetings and in school meetings, so on and so forth. The other part of looking at peace building, through inclusive education, is looking at teachers and what teachers can share, how they can share information between each other, facilitating dialogue between themselves and students, um, in a way that values both the student needs as well as the education of the staff. So again, it has to be reciprocal. It's not just teachers imparting knowledge on students, because students also impart knowledge on teachers. And if we are going to be true to ourselves about what education for all means and understanding the nuances of education that we've talked quite a bit about throughout these weeks about education for all, then we have to recognize that we learn from each other, that children have a lot to teach adults, just like adults have a lot to teach children. And we cannot expand concepts of what it's like to be more supportive, be more inclusive, be more um, open, so that we can get closer and closer to achieving, um, the type of achieving and experiencing the type of economies and social interactions that really do a variety of people very good all the time. It's not about perfection, it's about progress, and it's hard work, but it's about holding each other accountable in ways that are still uplifting the positive, but being real about some of the things that you just fall short on. So this can look like holding regular meetings with students, so that students can voice their opinions on the areas that need improvement, and things like having surveys, whether you want to do a formal survey with, a researcher or a consultant, or you just want to just have a general informal sort of survey dialogue, even, in your classrooms. And I just want to say, surveys should not be in place of having teacher-student dialogue interaction. right? You have to be able to create a culture in your classroom, and this falls on teachers and those that support them. You have to be able to have control enough of your classroom so that you create the environment that you want students to respond to. Um, there's a line in a movie that I love, and it says, I can't remember the movie at the moment, but it's with Denzel Washington, and it's the one where he takes hold of a football team, and it was an integrated football team at a, I believe, high school. And I cannot remember the name. Oh my goodness. If you know the name of it, please put it out there. But it was based off of a true story. And the line with which one of the guys says to the captain of the team, the captain was talking about the attitudes that some of the players were having, Black players in particular, because this is talking about integration of Black and white players. And he was just talking about, geez, you have a bad attitude and you need to get it together. And the Black player responded, who was played by Wood Harris. He said, attitude reflects leadership, Captain. And that is indicative of, at the end of the day, bringing it back to teachers, you have a level of authority in your classroom. And so you need to reflect the leadership that you want to see reflected back at you in the attitudes of the students. And that's just the way that it goes. And if you can't do that, then you either need to get more training on that, which is where the support comes in with administrators, and other schools, and the school systems, whether they're set up as districts or counties, whichever may be, that makes sure that that's happening, which is what was also called for in the framework about having education before you enter the classroom as well as ongoing. So those are some just real quick examples. But the important notes on this is that teachers have to be valued in societies with adequate pay and supplies to assist in their teaching. It's very difficult, but not impossible for teachers to do their best when they are living hand to mouth. If you're really struggling, it makes it that much more difficult to even think that far ahead when you are used to something that is just easy, that's going to get the results. Maybe not exactly what you want, but it's something that is acceptable to school administrators. So everybody has a responsibility from the top down to really ensure that this culture of inclusion is in place and adequately supported bit by bit. So to that end, a culture of peace, it calls for economic sufficiency, and it's important that actors in society that move forward the economy readjust their financial priorities. Everyday citizens have to apply pressure for the redistribution of wealth to protect the integrity of education for all. That's just where we are. Unfortunate, but necessary. Parents are a partner with teacher in providing inclusive education. So that includes intentionally exposing your children to other realities and encouraging them to explore those realities with respect and integrity and with the dignity of others at the center. This means helping children to sit with emotions and working through that, learning how to talk to people about things, and relearning that their communication is how it's perceived by others, so that they can have a sense of pride and belonging without developing superiority complexes and looking for perfection. That doesn't help anybody really in the long run. And then also remembering that children don't operate in vacuums, so it's equally as responsible, actually more responsible, that adults are constantly challenging each other, talking about modeling the type of behavior that we would like to see so that we can experience, we can challenge each other with our experiences that might be difficult without judgment, or at least learning the lesson from the judgment that you might have, um, because you're forced to imagine yourself in the other person's shoes. And these are everyday actions that build up over time. And it's not uniform behavior. It's not so much about uniform behavior, so much as it is about the uniform concepts and values, um, about how these behaviors might show up. So, of the things that have been talked about today, what are some things that you can apply? What are some things that you notice? Um, there are certainly ways to always improve on things. There are suggestions that you can bring forward, whether it be to your local schools, communities. And we didn't talk much about adults learning in terms of formal education, like universities and things, but I think the basis of starting with childhood education is to develop people so that when they become adults, whichever industry that they work in, which can include higher education, that they are thinking about how to include people, and train them, for different areas in ways that build out a more inclusive society. And that includes entrepreneurs thinking about how to be more inclusive, in their work practices. Um, and that includes the distribution of funds, equipment, uh, distribution of labor, how to interact with your workers. All of these things are encompassed in a culture of peace. How to limit and resolve discrimination that would pop up, um, and how to preserve the dignity of people that you come across, of the communities that you serve, and the type of products that you serve your community. And it can really go on and on from there. Um, and the point for all of our People of Peace sessions is to start where you can, to identify with these concepts that we present to you, that are well backed by international bodies, that are often um, available in other avenues, not just international bodies, but there are independent research, that we've also presented, and websites and so on and so forth that can get you to think a little bit deeper so that you can figure out for yourself how first it's impacted you. And once you identify how it has impacted you, you can start identifying what you like about it and what you don't. I'm pretty sure you'll find out a lot that you don't like about it. And then what is the way to move that forward? So, want to thank you for your time today. Apologies that we had a little bit of a late start, but we will continue on next week. And we won't have a live session next week, but the session will automate for viewing at the same time, on the same day. So next Thursday, 1500 UTC, and we will actually have a guest, a special guest. So we'll be talking with one of our partners over at the Earth Charter and exploring what it means to work toward a culture of peace within the education for all contexts as just a volunteer. And we're going to approach it really broadly. So, volunteer can be anybody. You can be a parent, you could be a teacher, you could be a student, you could be just an ordinary community member, uh, one of your family members, maybe, neighbor, anybody. So we look forward to having our session next week that's automated. And I want to thank you for your time. And we'll see you next week. Bye.